This is how the world looks right now. Or maybe, more accurately, this is how it feels. Because over the past few days, the situation between the United States and Iran has evolved so quickly and in such contradictory ways that it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand what is actually happening, and more importantly, where this is heading. In my previous video, I explained why the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the global economy. But since then, a series of events have taken place that may have just turned this regional conflict into something much bigger. To understand the present situation, we need to briefly go back. Before a ceasefire was actually agreed upon, Trump threatened via a post on Truth Social to bomb power plants and bridges in Iran, after which many Iranians formed human chains to protect those objectives. This post was then followed by a post signaling the deadline for this attack, followed by the most aggressive warning on Tuesday that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran didn't make a deal. This kind of rhetoric led many analysts to compare the situation to the madman theory, a strategy used during the Cold War to make opponents believe that a leader is unpredictable and capable of extreme actions. Meanwhile, Iran maintained that it had no interest in negotiations, and reports suggested that communication channels between the two sides were completely cut. So for a while, it genuinely looked like a direct escalation was inevitable. And yet, just hours before the deadline expired, a ceasefire was suddenly announced. Interestingly, this announcement didn't come directly from Washington or Tehran, but from Pakistan's Prime Minister via a post on X, suggesting that back-channel diplomacy was heavily involved, with both Iranian Foreign Prime Minister confirming it via a post on X and Trump via a post on Truth Social. According to the US version of events, Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and the US accepted a 10-point peace proposal as a basis for negotiations. However, the Iranian version tells a very different story. Based on statements from Iran's Supreme National Security Council, their conditions include: first of all, no negotiations without a complete stop to hostilities. Second, guarantees against future attacks. This is a key demand for Iran, who are understandably worried that the US and Israel might just use the negotiations as a pretext to prepare for another attack, as they have done in the past. Third, withdrawal of US troops from the region. For context, the US currently has 8 permanent military bases spread across the Middle East, with a further 11 temporary ones, which host tens of thousands of troops. Removal of sanctions and unfreezing of assets, and crucially, continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. On Wednesday, a spokesperson for Iran's oil, gas, and petrochemical products exporters union, which is closely aligned with the Iranian state, told the Financial Times that Iran would be collecting a toll equivalent to $1 per barrel of oil to be paid in Bitcoin from any passing tanker. This last point is extremely important because it directly contradicts the US claim that the strait would be reopened under neutral conditions, with about 20 million barrels per day passing through the strait to countries like China, India, Japan, South Korea, or the European Union. In practice, Iran appears to be maintaining de facto control over the strait. Reports suggest that ships are being allowed to pass only under coordination with Iranian forces. Even more importantly, Iran is allegedly charging tolls, in some cases up to millions of dollars per tanker. And geographically, this control is reinforced by the fact that traffic is being funneled through narrow routes near islands like Qashem and Larak, where Iran has a strong military presence. In the week that has passed since the ceasefire, the number of ships passing has started going back up, but they are far from the pre-war levels. The first ships to pass through since the ceasefire did indeed pass through Qashem and Larak, and the number of ships passing through actually fell from 11 on Tuesday before the ceasefire to just 4 on Wednesday according to ship tracking data. So while officially the strait may not be closed, functionally it is no longer a free international passage. And that matters because roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this single choke point. At the same time, there is another major inconsistency. It's still unclear whether the ceasefire includes Israel's operations in Lebanon. Initial statements suggested that it might, but Israel has since continued military operation against Hezbollah, indicating that from their perspective, the ceasefire does not apply to that front. Even US officials later described this situation as a misunderstanding, which raises a serious question. How do you have a ceasefire when the parties involved don't even agree on what it includes? Following the ceasefire, negotiations continued. For the first time since the Iranian Revolution, US and Iranian officials held direct talks. These lasted over 20 hours, and ultimately, they failed. The main sticking point remains Iran's nuclear program. After the talks collapsed, the US made a major move. Donald Trump announced a naval blockade. But this isn't a simple blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. According to US Central Command, the plan includes blocking ships entering or leaving Iranian ports, intercepting vessels that paid tolls to Iran, and potentially seizing ships already at sea. In other words, this is not just about restricting Iran. It's about controlling the flow of global trade in one of the most critical regions on Earth. And this is where things become extremely dangerous. Because in the past week, ships from both China and Russia have already passed through the strait, likely with Iranian authorization. So what happens if the US tries to stop them? From the perspective of Beijing or Moscow, this wouldn't just be enforcement of sanctions. It could be interpreted as a direct threat to their economic interests, and potentially an act of aggression, with China already calling the US blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Now add another layer. Iran has previously threatened to disrupt another critical choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, either directly using missiles or through its Yemen proxy, the Houthi rebels. This route connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and handles roughly 10% of global oil trade and basically all trade coming from China to Europe. If this strait would be closed, ships would have to take a much longer route, bypassing Africa and adding more than 1 month to delivery times and higher transport prices. If both Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb are disrupted at the same time, the consequences would be massive, like severe energy shortages, rapidly rising oil prices, global economic instability. And historically, moments like this tend to increase the risk of large-scale conflict. And now, adding to this already fragile situation, there are emerging discussions about a possible escalation involving Turkey, with reports claiming increased hostile rhetoric between Turkey and Israel, with Turkey calling Netanyahu Hitler of our time and accusing Israel of sabotaging the US-Iran peace talks, and Netanyahu accusing Erdogan of accommodating Iran's terror regime and massacring his own Kurdish citizens. Adding all of these tensions, you're no longer looking at isolated conflicts, but at increasingly interconnected conflicts, with US, Israel, and European countries on one side, and Iran, Russia, and China on the other side, being somewhat hard for Russia and China not to protect their interests in the region.